Good evening, everyone, and namaskar to all. First of all, I welcome all of you to this meeting, and especially I welcome the speaker of this evening, Professor Deepak Mishra, Director and Chief Executive of ICRIER, New Delhi. And so I also request the President of Odisha Economic Association, Professor Ravinaran Patra, to preside over this meeting. So before I invite the President of Odisha Economic Association to give his initial or opening remarks, let me also introduce the speaker and the topic. Professor Deepak Mishra is going to give a lecture on India's newfound macroeconomic stability, a blip or a trend. Professor Mishra is currently the Director and Chief Executive of the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. Prior to joining ICRIER, he was the practice manager at the World Bank's Macroeconomics, Trade and Investment uh, Global Practice, responsible for East Asia and Pacific region. Professor Mishra has held various positions at the World Bank, including the coordinator of the World Development Report 2016, the digital dividends. The theme of that was digital dividends, and country economist for Ethiopia, Pakistan, Sudan, and Vietnam. His research work has been published in various reputed journals, including the Journal of Development Economics, the Journal of International Economics, and the Journal of Agriculture Economics. Professor Mishra has also served as the World Bank's country economist for India, based in New Delhi, and working closely with the government of India and with several state governments, including Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, Gujarat, Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Punjab. Prior to joining the World Bank, Professor Mishra worked at Tata Motors, Federal Reserve Board, and the University of Maryland. Professor Mishra is born in Odisha. He received his MA in economics from Delhi School of Economics and PhD from the University of Maryland. So that is the brief introduction I can give about Professor Mishra. And that today's topic, is very relevant. There's a lot of debate is still happening about the growth trend, and so that's why this topic is so important. And in fact, we have been in touch with Professor Mishra for delivering this lecture for a long time, and because of his very busy schedule, no, it was not possible earlier. And so we are really thankful to you, Professor Mishra, for finding time for us. And so I'm sure actually the audience is going to really enjoy this lecture very much. And at the end, for the audience, we shall have the after me, perhaps the president of Odisha Economic Association, uh, Professor Ravinaran Patra, will give his welcome remarks, and then Professor Mishra will give his lecture, and then we'll have question and answer session, or we can have a lot of discussion after this. So with that brief note, now let me invite the president of Odisha Economic Association, Professor Ravinaran Patra, to give his opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
Esteemed Professor Mishra, um, honorable members of the association, I welcome you all to this colloquy. As we know, for an economy, three things are important. One is growth, the second one is stability, and then inclusion, or what we say social justice. India is one of the fastest growing economies among the major advanced and emerging economies in the world, and it has demonstrated exemplary competence in managing crisis situations like COVID and many disasters also. Uh, so it has done well so far as growth aspect is concerned, and resilience to internal problems. We have also moved a long way in terms of inclusion by reducing poverty and by improving the standards of living, livelihood, etc. of people. So what bothers us most for the present is stability. And in stability, as we know, we have to think of external stability and internal price stability. We all know that inflation has moderated. We have a large foreign exchange reserve surplus. Then the current account deficit has also moderated to some extent. But even then, we have problems on the stabilization front. And I hope today's deliberations will uh, discuss all these important issues relating to macroeconomic stability concerning the Indian economy. I don't want to stand between the honorable speaker of the occasion and our honored members. We will have we will listen first to Professor Mishra, and then we will have a question answer session where the doubts, queries, and problems that we may face will be answered adequately by our guest speaker. With this, I welcome you all, and it is over to Professor Mishra to start his deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you, President Patra and Dr. Das for inviting me. Let me begin by sharing my presentation and then I'll start the discussion, if it is all right. So, can you see
Yes.
my slide?
Yes, it is coming. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, now you can put it on full screen. But if you make full screen, you cannot see us. Yes.
That's okay. I don't have to see you as long as you can see me. And then if you
Yes.
ask. So, but let me begin by just saying it's a huge pleasure and a privilege to be able to deliver this lecture. So thank you very much for inviting me. I know some of the people in the audience, some of were friends, some are colleagues, some have been my teachers. So I really appreciate that you took time on a Saturday evening to come and join us. I'll try to keep it brief and so that we can have a lot longer Q&A. I think as Professor Patra started by saying, there are three pillars to a typical development framework, growth, stability, and inclusion. I think most of the time in the political economic debates that you see, it's often between growth and inclusion, and the macro stability often is the orphan in that three-pillar framework. It's the least understood and perhaps least appreciated of the three as to how important that is for development. So I'll talk a little bit about that and see where you're standing. The issue that I'm trying to get my head around is we clearly know that India has achieved unprecedented level of macro stability given its past track record and even compared to its peers around the world at this point of time. But is this stability that we can take for granted, that we have actually graduated to a higher level of stability so that we can be more secure on this? Or this is a cyclical, short-term, temporary phenomena, and we could easily lose it? That's the debate. I'm going to put forward a view, and I'd really like to hear back from you on what you think about it. But before I go, I just wanted to introduce the think tank that I'm associated with, the Indian Council Research on International Economic Relations. This think tank was established in 1981, following a series of balance of payment crises in the 1970s after the oil price shocks. As a recommendation that we need to create think tanks which looks at external sectors and India's economic relation to the rest of the world as a way to mitigate and safeguard against future crises. So today's topic is pretty relevant to what we do, though over time ICRIER has grown into various areas. We have agriculture, climate change, digital economy, but at the core we remain a trade, investment, economic relation think tank.
Professor Mishra, sorry to disturb you. Can you put it on the full screen mode? I think it's not on the full screen mode.
I have put it in full screen. Unfortunately, It's not? Should I restart again? Can you
Maybe that would be better. What you
or,
do is
or
you try to, yes, share the
Now it is visible. Now it is full screen visible.
oh, okay.
you can share the entire screen so that it
I
comes.
had done it, but I think let me share it again. Sometimes it takes a bit of a lag to come in, so just see if you're seeing it. So now I'm putting it full screen. Let's wait for 15 seconds to see if you can see it in full screen mode. What do you see now on your screen?
We see ICRIER, about ICRIER.
Yeah, but is that the full screen?
No, not yet.
Oh, sure. So I don't know if I can't do anything much about it unless you
Okay, fine.
have.
So I think we should proceed. Yes.
Okay, I think somebody said he or she can see it on full screen. So hopefully someone.
Amarendra, I think it is full screen. It is visible, I think.
Okay.
Okay.
Full,
Fine. Okay, fine.
Okay. So before I go, I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself, just that, introduce myself as well as my organization. Just want to tell you that I'm very much a product of Odisha's education. I was born in Bethnoti, spent most of my time around Similipal, Rairangpur, Bisoi, Jassipur, Baripada, and then spent 6 years in Sainik School, Bhubaneswar, and then 3 years in BJP College before I moved out to Delhi University, to Delhi School of Economics. And so it's a huge pleasure to be back and to have the pleasure of actually talking to the Odisha Economic Association. So with that, let me switch back to the topic for today. So as I begin by saying that India today is being seen as a source of global macro stability. So not only we have, from our time series perspective, India is relatively a lot more macro stable, and I'll define what macro stability I mean, but also from a global point of view. And here are 3 quotes, one from IMF, which says India is a bright spot for global economic revival. Another is the World Bank, which says global economy is weak, but US and India are the 2 bright spots. And then I have a quote from another ODIA governor, Shaktikant Das, who says Indian economy is an island of stability and macro and financial stability in an ocean of instability and fragility. And these were statements that were made, some 18 months, 24 months ago, but they remain valid. So clearly there is very little doubt that today India is a relatively stable, macro place. But this was always not the case. In the sense, if you go back to history, whenever there was a global crisis or when the world sneezed, India often caught the cold. And I'm just showing you some of the growth numbers, but growth is not stability, but behind this growth, there's high inflation, balance payment issues, or high interest rate, declining reserves. But this was a way to just summarize that every time there's a global crisis, you'll see that our growth slows down. So the oil price shocks, which is what led to the creation of ICRIER, you can see those red lines in the 1970s. Then the collapse of the Soviet Union when India had its own, and then Iraq War, which is our first BOP crisis. During Asian financial crisis, the dot-com recession, global financial crisis of 2008-9, and then the COVID pandemic. So every time there was an issue, we always had this slightly slow growth and a tinge of macro instability. So it's a valid question to ask, which is what I'm asking to the House, is if India has achieved macro stability today, which is a newfound macro stability, is this temporary or is this something that we can take for granted? Is it a blip or a trend? I'll first walk you through to show that there is indeed unprecedented level of macro stability. We'll look at that. Is this stability coming by kind of slowing down growth? Because that's one way you can achieve macro stability, the trade-off between growth and stability. If that's the case, then it's not a cause for celebration, because that is easy to achieve. If you really kill growth, you can always be stable, but that's not what we want to see. So is that happening in India?
Professor Mishra, sorry to bother. Actually, your slides are not moving. If you would you allow me to actually share the PPT?
Yeah, more than happy.
Or you do one thing like, okay, sorry. Okay, let me then share the PPT.
Okay, you are not able to see anything?
No, actually, when you make it probably full screen, we are not able to see the. Is it now visible to all?
Yeah, it's visible to me.
Okay. Okay. So.
Can you hear from others if they can see it?
Yeah, it is
Ah, it's
visible.
visible.
It is visible.
Okay.
It is visible.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Das, for doing that. And okay, so as I started by saying, because in the past we had a track record of poor macro stability, and if we have seen this, is this something that we should, look at carefully to see, is it a cyclical short-term phenomena, or is this a start of a long-term trend, a more structural break in the way the economy operates? So the presentation will be first to establish the fact, second look at the trade-off between growth and stability, then how India compares with its peers, because macro stability has a lot of external component to it. So it's a product of what's happening domestically, what's happening abroad. So we want to see how we are comparing with the rest of the world. If we are we doing better than them? Are we doing same as them? Are we doing worse than them? Because that determines how good we are, because macro stability is always a relative concept in that way. And then we'll come to the answer of the question. Finally, we'll look at the implication of this. So the okay, can we move it a little bit up now? Yeah, next slide, please.
The
Next
next
slide. Yeah. So if you look at a 40-year perspective, so the data goes from 1980 to 2024, and I'm going to look at three variables, which are perhaps there are many ways you can think of what is macro stable. The first would be inflation, because that's a product of the domestic demand and supply. And if for some reason, if there's a lot of distortion or imbalance, then we'll see a lot higher inflation and much more volatile inflation. The second would be exchange rate, which is no, I'll come to exchange rate later. Let's go through the inflation first. And then the last will be the current account balance. So I'm just going to focus on those three, but these are symptomatic of larger macro economic variables that we see. So first is, if you look at inflation, there's clearly a downward, secular decline in inflation rate. We used to double-digit inflation for a very long time. If you look at the 80s, 90s, and even post-global financial crisis, we used to have inflation of 10, 11% a year. And after COVID, the max we hit was 6.7%, and today it's 4.6. The core inflation is even lower. A lot of the food inflation is because of food price. But it's not that we never had such low inflation. If you go back to early 2000, we had actually a period of fairly low and stable inflation. And that's why I also wanted to look at a little bit of the political economy of this. And if you look at the second graph on the right, you see the same inflation, but now instead of a trend line, I put the average growth rate during the different tenure of the government. The NDA, so first is the 1990s, 80s and 90s, which I put as one group. Then the NDA-1, which is the Bajpayee regime, the UPA-1 and UPA-2, which is 2004 to 2009 and 2009 to 14. Then NDA-2, which is Modi-1, and NDA-3, which is Modi 2.0. So and what you see is there is and this is a story that I'll come back to later on, as to if you see the two periods of low growth was NDA-1 and 2, and UPA-1 and 2 are much higher, NDA-3 was somewhere in between. So there is a story that will slowly get built as to different political regimes in India do have different preference over growth and inflation. Some like growth more than stability, and some like stability more than growth. And that obviously has a determining factor where we stand at the end of the day. Let's go to the next slide on exchange rate. Here, if you look at the exchange rate, and the left graph shows the rate of change, which is the depreciation of the exchange rate. So positive means depreciation, negative means appreciation. And the second, the right graph shows the standard deviation of the depreciation rate. So if you are, very high means you're highly confident. By the way, if you are not speaking or don't have a question, could you mind mute your mic, please? Okay, I think it's coming from Mr. Das. Okay. Can you continue to hear me? I hope so. Okay, so this is the exchange rate story, where you see that the rate of exchange rate depreciation This is from year to, so this is monthly data from year to year. So if I'm looking at March 2019 depreciation, that is March 19 to 18 change. And what you see is, interestingly, the rate of depreciation appreciation was much higher, especially after the global financial crisis, and we have started to see a decline both. So the overshooting and the undershooting that you used to see from the equilibrium exchange rate was much higher in the earlier period, and over time this has actually come down. It's very interesting in the sense this shows a pretty clear pattern, but the important thing is it just accidental, or there is something really happening that our monetary policy authorities are able to have a better policy function, that they can actually understand how exchange rate behaves, how the exchange market participants are behaving, so that they can do much better management of it. If you look at the stability, again, the stability has also come down over time, so especially after global financial crisis. So both in the rate of change and the standard deviation of the depreciation, we have seen a decline, which is why we are heading to such a more stable environment. And also, if you look at the political regime, again, you will see that so we had a big burst of depreciation during UPA2, which was the post-global financial crisis, also the time when India was considered to be part of the Fissile Five. Subsequently, we have seen much lower, and the last 6 to 8 months of 2023 and 24 has been unusually stable. In fact, a lot of people are surprised as to how much rupee has been, it's one of the strongest currency in the world today. While a lot of strong currencies like yen and others have dramatically depreciated, rupee has been strong. And the question is it fundamentals, or is it some ideology that government prefers a strong currency and there's a lot of intervention to keep it strong? And but the bottom line is we are seeing a lot more stability in the foreign exchange rate. Next slide. On the current account balance or the deficit, there we do not see a dramatic shift. So India always have been very conservative when it comes to current account balance and trade balance. So normally it's between 2 to 3%. And when I say conservative, it's from a global standard. I've worked in East Asia and Latin America and others where they run a much higher current account deficit than what India is. But India had this big problem in the 2011, 12, and 13, when the current account deficit reached 5%, and that's when we had the severe problem on the balance payment side and all. But India also has run current account surplus several times. Obviously, during COVID-19 we had it, but even during Vajpayee regime, there's actually fairly large amount of surplus, at least 1 year. And so it's not unusual, but you see a lot of variation around the trend. When you look at the regime, you also see that there's a much larger current account deficit. By the way, the negative is deficit, positive is surplus. So the UPA2 had a large deficit, whereas both NDA1, NDA2, and to some extent NDA3 have much lower deficit. So you'll see a kind of pattern that I'm going to come out at the end. But the bottom line is we have seen both a long-term trend, but also in the last few months and quarters, lot more lower inflation, much less volatility in the foreign exchange market, and continuing shrinking of the current account balance, which is why people say it's highly stable. Next, go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, is this stability coming at the cost of growth? So let's go to the next slide. So here, what we've done is we have a scatter plot of what was happening to growth pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, because I'm focused on the last few years to see, is this last few years unusual? So if the last few years we're trying to curb, to achieve macro stability, we're trying to curb growth, then what you see is that the post-pandemic growth would be, relative to others, would be much lower than pre-pandemic. But what you see is exactly the opposite. You see that the India is much higher above the trend, which means based on a pre-pandemic growth at a cross-country level, what we should be growing in the post-pandemic, we're actually growing higher than that. So India actually has the largest variation from the trend, except Turkey, which actually is growing even faster than India in terms of the post versus pre. But we know that Turkey has achieved, has actually, this growth has come at a massive macroeconomic instability. They've actually lowered interest rate was negative at some point. So clearly you could stimulate the economy through various ways, but that can't be sustained. So in that sense, Turkey would not be a good example of, even if you're getting higher growth, but it is coming at the expense of weak macro stability. But India clearly is a good example where we have got relatively more growth post-COVID, while the macro has been more stable. And in fact, a lot of the other countries, let's say G7, except US and China, Korea, Thailand, they have actually seen much lower growth rate in the post-COVID period compared to what they were in the pre-COVID. So in a sense, the argument I'm making, which is obviously a little superficial, saying that there are good reasons to believe that this macro stability is not coming at the cost of growth. Now let's go to the next one, is what is, if you look at India's own story over time, and here rather than plotting the growth and the inflation rate, I plotted the average. To show you, so on the left side, you see the blue line is the growth rate, the orange line is the inflation rate. What you see is India's growth rate has been fairly constant. It has fluctuated year to year by some decimal points, but we have grown around between 6 and 6.5 for a very long period of time, 30 to 40 years. So in that sense, growth has been fairly invariant to where the inflation and the macro. But whereas if you look at the inflation, that has actually fluctuated quite significantly over this 4-decade period. But if you look at the political economy story, you do see that the NDA 1, 2, 3 tends to have lower average inflation. The UPA 1 and 2 and the Congress regime in the first of the 91 to 96 also had a much higher inflation rate. It's sometimes very difficult to compare this time periods because Indian economy is very different over time. So one could criticize saying, you should be comparing all those and trying to make a heroic conclusion from it. But I do believe that there's a pattern in the story. And what you see is at least that's my hypothesis, and we can argue about it. If you think of the typical Keynesian, aggregate supply and demand curve, to some extent, and this has happened more in recent years than the past. So your X is the equilibrium between aggregate demand and supply. And I believe that UPA tends to prefer to push the demand curve more. So they prefer to give consumers the handout or tax subsidy or exemption or things like Manrega and direct transfer. So the consumer consumption, so aggregate demand shifts outward, which means your inflation or prices goes up as well as output goes up. And whereas BJP or the NDA tends to be more focused on the aggregate supply side, which means if you're pushing the supply, the investment, the infrastructure side, you end up with a similar output or growth rate, but with a lower inflation. And that's the reason I was trying to bring the NDA UPA story into this, is eventually you're ending up with a fairly similar growth rate over the 40-year periods, but the macro stability are very different. One could say, oh, that means UPA provides you higher inflation and lower stability, so it should be inferior to one where you can get the same growth rate lower. But that's a debatable issue because of money illusion and all sorts of things. One could think about, what's the better outcome? But obviously, I'm saying there is a very different policy preference rate among our main political parties, which might end up giving you the situation where growth has been invariant and the macro stability has been the one which has taken a hit over time. Now let's go. So in a sense, there is the growth stability trade-off exists, but in one case it works in the same direction, in the other case it works in the opposite direction. But now comes the most important part of the presentation, which is, but is this what we are seeing in India completely unique, that it's our macroeconomic managers in the RBI and the Minister of Finance who are responsible for this turnaround? Or is it that this is a global story? And it turns out that actually, despite all the chest thumping we do, India's macro stability is not unusually different from what we see in the rest of the world. So here I've showed you the inflation rate for India and the G20. That the trend line, as you see, which is there in the past, the orange is India and the blue is G20. And what you see is both are downward sloping. So in a sense, we are starting in 1980s. This is the Volcker disinflation period. If you remember, Reagan inherited US with 20% inflation rate, and Volcker went through this dramatic disinflation. So the whole world experienced this post-oil price crisis, and the whole world is actually started to see this. But then global financial crisis came. In India, we saw a much higher inflation than the rest of the world, but the world has come down. In COVID, things have started to flip. This is the first time in India's history that India actually had a lower inflation than the G20 average. So clearly something we've done right. But if you think of a long-term trend, there is no big difference. And the right picture shows even more. So here I have done G20, the entire world average, and I've taken developing 13, which are the 13 most dynamic developing countries. These are the 10 developing countries which are in G20, plus Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Philippines. So the ASEAN 4. Normally it's ASEAN 5, but Indonesia is already in G20, so I've taken the rest 4. And what you see is how dramatic their disinflation has been over this time period. So if you compare India to developing 13, clearly there's nothing great that we have done, despite the fact that from our own record, it's very dramatically better. Let's go to the next slide. When it comes to current account balance, the story is the same. That while, so let me just focus on the right picture. So if you look at, again, the developing 30, G20, India, and the world, current account balance has improved modestly, in the sense if the slope is upward sloping, that means you are moving from deficit to surplus modestly. The closer you are to zero, the less is the deficit. But you are doing much worse than G20 and certainly much worse than developing 13. So clearly what we are seeing in India is to some extent, we are seeing it in many other successful developing countries around the world. So while we should be giving credit to our own policymakers and economic managers, but we also have to realize that this is a global story. Now, when it comes to exchange rate, there, I think the story is slightly better in favor of India. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So here, if you look at the exchange rate between India and G20, what you start to see is that there is now slowly the spread has started to shrunk, and India is actually not exhibiting the same level of volatility as you see in the average G20 countries. The story also is not very different if you look at the G20 developing or the developed 13. So clearly, exchange rate is one place where there seems to be a lot more stability they compared to what you see with inflation, and others where India's story is not very different. And the exchange rate, it's largely the post-COVID, which is the last 36 months, and not not a very long-term thing. So in a sense, what we are seeing is obviously there has been improvement, but we are also seeing a similar story around the world, and especially in the ASEAN 5, which are perhaps the right comparator for India. So let's go to the next slide. So the question that we wanted to ask is, so if we are seeing this improvement, how much is it structural changes in the economy that has made us this? And remember, when you look at countries' history over the last 50 years, we know that the rich countries, at least until very recently, were the most stable from a macro point of view. So when IMF and others do macro monitoring, they rarely do a macro monitoring of those, because the assumption is the core is the strongest part of the global economy, and the peripheries, which is where the emerging markets and development are the weak part. So the core are always the strongest part and the weak. Of course, in the last few years, the story had changed. Now we see a lot of crises originating in the core. US or UK and others have been a source of vulnerability to the world economy and not. But over the 70s, 80s, 90s, for a very long period of time, it was the story that as you become richer a country, the more the more stronger your macro stability becomes. So in that sense, India has moved from being a low income to a lower middle income and could soon become an upper middle income country. So is this part of that trend that we are, as we get richer and our policymakers get more experience, that we are able to better handle macro crisis or macro shocks, and that's why you have it, or this is just a fluke, a trend? So first thing I wanted to say that obviously based on past track record, India's current macro stability is very impressive and highly unprecedented. Even if we get annoyed by the high inflation that we have seen in the last few months, but that actually pales into insignificance compared to the inflation that we have lived with most of our adult life, which is in double digit. And the good feature of this macro stability is that it has been achieved without sacrificing economic growth. At least there is no strong evidence to believe that this stability is coming at the cost of growth. And especially if the focus is more on the supply side, then you could achieve more growth with some level of macro stability. But clearly there are two reasons why it's very hard to argue that this is going to be a structural break in the economy. The first is that we do see this is happening in many parts of the world. So clearly there's a huge amount of external factors involved in this. The commodity is a low price of gas or petrol, other commodities, the quantity easing and others have certainly helped India and other developing countries to manage the macro better. So if the external environment becomes less favorable, there is no guarantee that we can continue to do it. Though India seems to, the last few years, the macro environment or external environment has not been as stable, and India has managed to do it. But it's something that clearly shows that there's an external component which is beyond our control. I think the second part is, which is kind of more controversial, but based on kind of limited work that I've just gone through the last few months, there seems to be a very different preference on our main political parties when it comes to growth and stability. So it's very easy to imagine that if there's a change in politicalism, one could easily reverse the current trend. So it is a function of your macroeconomic fundamentals of the country, global economic environment, and your own political preference of the people who are in power. So taking all these three together, my conclusion is this is something that's is not to be taken for granted. This could easily be reversed either when politicalism changes or when global economic environment changes. Though there is good reasons to believe that this is going to, we are slowly building a track record, and that could eventually push us into a new catapult into a new stage where India would be less worried over macro stability, with your investment grade and the rating agencies and others upgrading it. There is a possibility of that happening, but certainly today's evidence don't support it. But even if it doesn't happen in the even if there's likely to be a reversal in the future, there's some very important implications of the current regime. So the first thing is, this is a picture that some of you might have seen, 200 years of economic history in one chart, which basically shows, where the world started. Of course, in 180, there are not many countries in the world. So India and China were two largest civilizations with very large share of the global economy. Over time, their share in the global economy came down, and it, most of the Western democracies, it went up. But then from 1990s, in case of China from 1980s, we have started to see this improvement. And this graph stops at 2017. If you draw the graph at 2024, you'll see India's share is much higher. It's pretty much similar to Japan and clearly higher than Russia and Italy and Spain and all the people. So in a sense, things have changed. But what's likely to happen is, this story is going to accelerate for the following reason. So let's go to the next slide. That India's global footprints are going to expand fairly quickly. Next slide, please. Because of this story, that the exchange rate is going to start to play a much more dominant role in the overall GDP when measured in US dollar. So if you look at what I've done here is I've decomposed GDP growth in US dollar into three components. How much it is coming from real growth, how much is because of inflation, or the GDP deflator change, and how much of because of exchange rate or depreciation. So if you look at this story, so between 2008 and 2020, because India's rupee had depreciated significantly during this period, a lot of the growth, both in terms of growth plus the inflation, which is the nominal growth rate, were being offset by the depreciating currency. But if what you have seen in the last few months or quarters of exchange rate, that the rupee has been a lot more stable, if this trend continues, and this is what the IMF predicts also, so this is actually from the IMF projecting 2029. So the projection is that exchange rate depreciation is going to be much smaller from 2024 onwards, almost 0.5% or zero depreciation. But that would assume that you're managing your economy so well and your inflation is low enough that there is not pressure, or your external sector is behaving well, that there is no pressure. But if that trend persists, you're going to see much faster increase in GDP in dollar terms. And so in US, so India would be overtaking Japan next year, and then Germany before 2030. So that's one. The second is what will happen is once you do that, if you look at India's share in the next slide, please, in the global growth is going to considerably rise over time. So we have been steadily rising. So, if you look at the pre-global financial crisis, it was 7%. If you look at the 2010 to 2019, it's 10.3. And this is more conservative than what I believe is going to happen over the next few years. So India's contribution to global growth was 12%. In some cases, it has been 15, 16, but if you look at the decadal average, it's about 12 to 13%. So that's going to make India a major player on the global front, because you would be a big part of the story, just the way the China is or US is today. So those are some of the big long-term implications of this. So let me conclude by summarizing that while we have achieved unprecedented level of macro stability, and this has happened amidst global uncertainty and polycrisis. So this is a very important development from an Indian context, and I think kudos to our policymakers for making this happen. And this augurs very well for India in the near term. With more stable macro environment, we should be able to attract more investment, both FDI, portfolio, and others. It should also help firms to have more courage to take investment and have higher productivity. And it should also help India to expand its global footprint in terms of the size of its contribution to the global growth process. But there is no strong reason to assume that this is a break that's structural, that what we are seeing today is so unique to India and entirely driven by domestic fundamentals that this is here to stay. The global factor continues to play a very big role in India's macro stability, and the fact that Indian policymakers have very different preference over growth and stability makes it pretty fragile, that you could easily turn back the tide and go back to a much more or less stable macro context in the near future. So deteriorating global conditions and a new policy regime that prefers growth or stability could easily derail India's success story. So I've deliberately kind of took it side or a view just so that we can have a debate on this. This is something that's a work in progress. We are actually writing a paper on this, and I'd love to hear your feedback and your comments on that. Thank you very much. So there have been a couple of hands. Is that audible?
Yes. So thank you, Professor Mishra, for a very interesting presentation. Yes, now we can take the questions. The first hand raised is by Professor Birendra Kumar Bhoi. So yes, Professor Bhoi, you may unmute and ask a question.
Good evening to everybody. Dr. Mishra is very close to my native place. The Pike Sahi, very close to Betanat. We have not met, but we are both of us. We are away from the native place. Anyway, now instead of talking about growth versus stability, can we talk that growth with stability? This option is possible or not? You are telling this is a blip that probably it may not continue for a long time. Yes, the reasons you are telling, if there is a regime change, possibly yes. The regime change is not the issue. Issue is if there is a change in the macroeconomic policy. So if there is a change in the macroeconomic policy, then probably there will be a problem that your fundamentals will go haywire and you will end up in high rate of inflation. Inflation harms growth if it exceeds the threshold, then growth will also slow down. So growth versus stability, yes, that is one view, but at the same time, growth with stability is also another option in macroeconomics. Although earlier we are talking high growth and low inflation is a divine coincidence. High growth means aggregate demand is more, inflation ought to be high. But that is not the issue. Issue is if you can have a good macroeconomic policy, you can grow at your potential with low rate of inflation. That is what it is. You can grow at your potential, then inflation will not be there. Will not be there. If you are growing above your potential, probably overeating will lead to inflation, and this is a possibility. That is what actually my quick comment on your perspective. But unless there is a policy mistake, my feeling is that for some time we can continue with high rate of growth with stability. That is what actually why I am telling there are quite a few tailwinds which are supporting our growth. What are these tailwinds? That it is financed from within. Indians are super savers. The saving rate as percentage of GDP is not rising because of household liabilities are increasing, and the household liabilities are increasing. That's why they are mainly acquiring these houses, physical assets, physical saving they are having anyway. That is a possibility, but they are super savers, and about 80 to 90% of our financing is done from within. We are not dependent on foreign countries for our investment. Foreign investment, the current account deficit is a percentage of GDP, which is around say 1% or so on an average recently. So that will supplement our savings, and it is a minor component. So this is one tailwind that domestic saving will propel the growth. Then second is India is now a leader in the field of digitization. It is not limited to payment and settlement system. Government is having a policy for digitization. All offices, etc., everything they want to digitize. Of course, there is a downside. Downside is this growth may be jobless, or job growth will not be there commensurate with economic growth. That is possible, and this is not possible in India. This is the worldwide phenomenon. Fourth industrial revolution, we depend on productivity. Productivity increase will come from if you are adopting the new technology. New technology is definitely labor displacing, that you cannot avoid. That's why there is a need for welfare scheme, inclusive growth. These are some of the problems which will be coming in the times to come. Inclusive growth, reducing inequality. You will agree that absolute poverty has come down drastically. Inequality has gone up. And inequality has not gone up in India alone. Inequality has gone up everywhere. People are more concerned about productivity, high growth, animal spirit, private sector. Naturally, it will have high rate of growth in the times to come. Probably it will not be labor intensive. or growth may not be promoting employment. There lies the problem. Our employment numbers are very confusing. Today newspaper also you might have seen KLEM RBI data and this household survey data. There is a lot of discrepancy. Whatever the case may be, employment is a problem in India. The nature of employment in India is very complex. The growth is probably not taking care of employment, or we have to grow probably 10% or 10% plus to take care of the growing unemployment. Thank you very much.
Professor Mishra, would you like to respond, or will take some more questions?
I can quickly respond. I think I won't disagree with Dr. Voi. I think what I was trying to do was to, rather than getting into, obviously a policy regime change has nothing to do with macro stability unless it's mediated through certain variables, which is what you're trying to say. So the policy regime was a simple way to demonstrate that this is what we are seeing. So obviously when you say a different government comes to power, they have there are different ways they would implement the policy. So it will have implication on fiscal policy, on transfers, on fiscal deficit, on debt, on monetary policy. So in a sense, I was not getting into all that stuff, but I agree that of course what at the end of the day matters is the fundamentals of the economy, which affects your macro, and it's not the policy regime per se, but that's a symptom, or that's the proxy variable that you look at to understand what's happening. Obviously, if you want to go to the fundamentals, I'm sure you'll find that during UPA 1 and 2, there was high deficit, looser monetary policy and all that stuff. But I was not getting into that, but that's, I would say, I will agree. If you look at, Subbarao has a very nice book on, who increased my interest, or I'm forgetting the title of his book, where he makes this argument that in India, most monetary central bank governors struggle to convince why it is good to have a stable macro environment, because the feeling is the moment you try to stabilize the economy, it's going to kill growth in the short term. And he makes this argument that actually in the long term, economy benefits, so we have to pay that price to do it. But what you're starting to see is that we are now in that situation where you are starting to see the benefits much quicker, because we have a track record of doing it. So in that sense, there is a growth with stability phase that you'll see. So that it's not a trade-off anymore. We are currently in a place where we are seeing both happening at the same time. And that's the story on the aggregate supply. If the focus is more on aggregate supply, you can achieve both, and you don't have to increase your inflation to get the growth. I agree with the tailwinds. I think on the digitalization, I want to be a little careful. We do a lot of work in ICRIER on this, and I've done quite a bit. But thing is, there's a lot of feeling that digitalization and others are going to be a big solution to a lot of our problems, which it might be or may not be. But remember, even during UPA 1 and 2 especially, a lot of the big ideas happened then, whether it was Aadhaar, whether it was UPI. Many of those ideas were conceived. The internet penetration was growing very rapidly. Geo came a bit later, but a lot of the digital story was still happening. But that, but if you look back to 2012, 13, what you remember most is the fragile macroeconomic environment. So even if the structural variables are doing well, or the structural drivers of growth, unless the macro is stable, a lot of the structural factors might, lose its sheen, which is what I'm making the argument that we often underappreciate how important is the macro to the growth story of India. But overall, I think I agree with what you said and appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. So now we'll invite Professor Manoj Panda. Sir, Manoj sir, you can unmute and ask your question.
Yeah. No, thank you, Professor Mishra, for very focused discussion. I particularly like that will possibly contribute towards increasing growth in in international comparison, we'll be nearer to that compared to what our real growth speaks in terms of rupee. And possibly some countries have achieved that for quite some time, particularly South Korea and few other countries at different stages of development. But be that as it is, my question is, have we reached the potential on the growth curve, or there is still we can do something more to achieve 8%, 8.5% growth? Do you see that in the near future? Secondly, a related question again. Behind the monetary policy committee's entire analysis lies the Blip curve, which has an implicit trade-off between growth and inflation. So in that case, possibly, at least we have to have some kind of view that, okay, the current level of inflation is fine and whatever potential we can achieve, let's do that without going, experiencing higher inflation. That might be, these are the questions. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Panda. So, should I answer, Dr. Das?
Yes, please do.
Yeah. Okay. So, I think it's a very good question as to whether India has achieved its growth potential or there is more to go. I would certainly say that, there's a lot more to grow for two reasons. First is, if you really look at the way the Modi 1, 2, the NDA 2 and 3 regimes have actually governed this. There's a lot more emphasis on infrastructure, which is good because that's where the potential growth rate comes into play. But also a lot more on implementation, of ideas. But when you think of big policy reforms, in terms of trade reform, in terms of administrative reform, in terms of judicial reform, governance reform, we haven't really seen a lot of those. So in that sense, I think because the current government is much more effective in implementing things, especially when it comes to infrastructure, they're getting a lot out of it without doing the big policy reform that had happened. And a lot of the policy reform had started before the government came in, so they're taking advantage of that. But I do feel that India needs some big, important policy changes over the next, and I think the big one is trade for sure. If you look at some of the paper by Arvind Subramaniam and others, it talks about hardware versus software. And he says, India is doing very well on hardware, but not so much on software. And software is, as I said, one of them is trade. I think we have, India has actually reversed a lot of the trade policies, and the current ones are actually not working in terms of either in improving the competitiveness of the Indian industry and making India a big production hub. So I think trade policy is certainly something one needs to look at. The second is, this is not my view, like I haven't done research, but there's a fairly large degree of consensus that India, the reforms that India is doing a lot more, these are reforms for specific sectors or companies. So but they're not reforming the market in the sense of they are. So there's a bit of that happening, that you are not doing wholesale market reforms with a level playing field, and there's a lot more concentration of in some cases infrastructure and others, which could also reduce competition. So I feel there's a whole list of important policy reforms that government could do, along with its very high implementation capacity. Together, India could easily do 8 to 9% growth rate if both engines are firing. At this point, I think one of the cylinder is not firing as much as it should be. So that would be my answer on the growth potential for the Indian economy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, Professor S.K. Pradhan.
Yeah, thank you.
Professor Pradhan, you can unmute and ask.
Thank you. Namaskar, Deepak Babu. After a long time, nice to see you. I actually would like to make a little observation on. Am I audible, right?
Yes, you are.
On exchange rate. I think nicely you portrayed the stability in level and volatility. So I feel this outcome is based on something that the way we have managed our external sector. Because I believe I think exchange rate in India probably is primarily a product of our external sector. Trade in a capital account, and capital account to include both flows under equity and cap bonds, and of course subject to RBI interventions. But I believe not so much to inflation, real sector performance, or monsoon, uh, things like that. So therefore, I think it's a product of more of external sectors, and so therefore finally determined by the capital flows and the volatility moderated by RBI interventions. The stability, I can say that need your comments. Whether we have ensured interest rate parity, inflation targeting, and accommodating the exogenous shocks like oil price shocks. So all of these have helped us by interventions that RBI has done, both spot and forward. There were few periods, very few periods when the spikes were quite significant, like COVID or the war or the US downgrade or things like that. But otherwise, most of the period, FTSE was fairly stable. And I would add also the credibility has been offered, is ensured by FX reserves, and more importantly, a sustainable external debt. So if we see the evidence of effective rate, the weighted average rate, I think two observation I can make it from 2015 onwards. There has been a 10% depreciation of the nominal rate, which is not much, effective rate, which is not much as compared to Asians. Many Asian economies have kept the nominal exchange rate a bit undervalued. I said about 10%. And there is even a 6% appreciation of the real effective rate. If you compare 15-16, there is actually the real rate is appreciated. So I'm just asking a question, if my evidence, whatever I presented is convincing, is it good to have some undervalued rupee? Of course, avoiding volatility, that's of course the policy interventions needed. But I believe the good to have some undervalued rupee if we want to capitalize, because I see the real appreciation has taken place. Maybe that's not worrying RBI. If the nominal depreciation has taken place, the RBI finds the comfort zone because real appreciation has taken place. That's because of the inflation difference. So is it good to have some kind of, even going towards a stable real rate, that would also ensure some depreciation of the nominal rate?
Yeah, Dr. Pradhan, that's a very good question. I think it's a good debatable issue. So Danny Roderick and others have, there's an echo of my voice. Somebody needs to mute. So I mean, there's a big debate as to whether a depreciated exchange rate helps a country, and a lot of trade economists like Danny and others have taken this view that China and a lot of the large export countries have actually deliberately kept the exchange rate depreciated, and that has been a huge competitive advantage to them. I think in Indian context, people would continue to take that same approach and make the same argument, and it might be true. But there are, Geeta Gopinath and others in IMF recently have started working where they're showing that most of the depreciations are not haven't really produced the stimulant effect that people were expecting out of it. Partly because many countries are not big producers of manufacturing goods and others, which is where the depreciation helps. So in a sense, you are, a lot of them have very inelastic exports, and it actually doesn't really work that way. And there's also the way some of the foreign exchange transactions happen, the way the world trade happens, the depreciation doesn't really give you that benefit. But I don't know enough to make you that comment. But what we know is that BJP has often put in their manifesto and others that they want the Indian currency to be strong. I think most trade economists say that's a bad idea, but that has been, avowed objective of the government, that they prefer a strong currency to a weak one. I don't know what the Congress views on this, but to me, when you make it so explicit, I think it does send a signal to finance ministry officials and governors and central banks that they don't want rupee to depreciate too much. And Prime Minister Modi has, during his election campaign and others, had criticized when India's depreciation, rupee depreciation. The other thing is setting targets in dollars. So the fact that a lot of the targets now set in dollar makes you that the moment you depreciate your currency, you do it. I have had some conversation with the trade minister, Mr. Piyush Goyal, where he has been emphatic. He says, I used to be an entrepreneur and I know that depreciation doesn't help. Whether he's taking a political line or he believes in it from his personal experience. So that's what I'm saying. Sometimes fundamentals are important, but the political ideology also makes a difference. And today, if you look at, I only presented you the exchange rate, and exchange has been very flat over the last 6 to 8 months. But if you look at what has happened to reserves, of course, reserves on absolute terms is growing, but that's because as the economy are growing. But RBI is certainly intervening a lot more to defend the rupee and not depreciate more. That's because perhaps they also get a signal that if there's too much depreciation, it will not be liked with the government. So there is an element of that. So I think I'm digressing. I think my personal belief is, I think that a competitive exchange rate is a good thing on the whole, especially if other things are in place. Like if you are protecting with high tariff, then perhaps exchange depreciation will not help. So if you're an open economy, you are competing in a global market, and there's a lot of export potential, or you're operating in markets where the margins are very limited. I think there, and if you have underutilized capacity, then a depreciation would certainly help you in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now we may invite Dr. Sarath Kumar Malik. Dr. Malik, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Mishra. You really made a good presentations. Congratulations. My limited point is that talk about the financing. Both the private sector as well as the government sector CapEx needs to be increased. So in the scenario when this is not happening in India now, how to achieve this growth rate? So whatever, the IMF has said or government has fixed that. So how to achieve this growth rate? And now the financial savings are more going towards the mutual funds from the traditional banking sector. Even it has been reported in the press by a statement by Governor Das and even others also. So there is a shift of the financial savings from the traditional banking to the securities market. So we are moving from the banking-oriented system to a market-oriented system. So in that scenario, what the policy perspective or the policy measures the government should take to see that the adequate funds are there for investment to achieve this growth rate? So that is one question. And the second question is that your growth has been, you during your presentations, you have said that during BJP regime, during UPA regime, the growth rates, so and so. But it has not corresponded to the increase in the, employment opportunities. So there is a debatable, there is a lot of debate about the data or the reports from the RBI that inflation has necessary. This employment has gone up, but there is other people also, they say that the data is not, sort of agreeable to the others. So it has some lacunas and others. So in this two perspective, when the growth rate is increasing, the employment the country is not able to generate the employment. That is one. And the first point, that how to increase the capex in the scenario of the funds are diverting from the traditional banking sector to the finance sector or to the market oriented system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Malik. Yeah, it's a good question as to if the capex doesn't increase, how will you achieve those growth rates, and how does your potential growth rate increase? So, I think when I said that the current government is good in implementation but has been weak on policies, I think this is one area I would point out as to if you ask, I think FM once said that he compared the industries to Hanuman, saying that even you don't know how much power you have and you should push yourself. So that, by that she meant that a lot of industries in India are pretty competitive and they should have confidence in themselves and invest in this. But if you go and talk to industry associations in CII, ASSOCHAM, there's very strong resistance to make big investment, long-term, big investment. And if the data shows there's been slight recovery in the last 2 years, but fairly modest based on, if you look at how much push government has been doing versus how much they're getting is very little. You would expect a lot more investment coming. I think there are three reasons why we haven't seen more. I think the first is there's a lot of fear of this retroactive policies being used, and it could be. So I think there's a lot of fear in private businesses as to whether they would get caught up on some of those things. I think in the previous regime, perhaps the policy existed, but they always knew that somehow they could get out of things in the court, and now there's the fear that. So I think there's this. A lot of industries are simply not ready to put up a large sum of money because of this kind of fear. I think, but more important is, despite all the rhetoric, I don't feel like India has actually proceeded more on the deregulation front when it comes to liberalizing policies, making it easier for companies to comply with rules and regulation and others. In fact, most of the rules remain on the books and they are being enforced more tightly now, rather than deregulating. So I think the deregulation agenda has slowed down. I think trade reforms have slowed down, which is very, for many of the industries which need cheap imported, low cost imported inputs like textile and garments and others are actually suffering. I feel the privatization agenda has also slowed down quite a bit. Now the focus is to modernize the PSUs, and which has actually yielded good results. But I can tell you, when you have different political regimes who may not be able to turn around those PSUs as the current government is doing, you will go back to the same old story of PSU reform. So I think when the prices are high, it's a good time to liberalize or privatize some of those things. And finally, some of the reforms on labor market, land market, farm have also stalled. And I think the government has, in the previous regime, they were pushing it too hard without much consultation, but now they have to do it differently. But those reforms haven't really changed, in the sense they not doing them and still expecting growth to be high is not going to happen. So I feel there's a whole long list of agenda that is still awaited in terms of ensuring that Indian industries are more competitive and they have more confidence to invest. I think on the growth and the jobs, I'm very confused. As somebody said, the jobs data are actually very confusing. If you look at PLFS data, there's a lot more jobs being created. Claims data that RBI just released also shows a lot more jobs being created. So if there's so many jobs being created, though they're not salaried jobs, they're the the self-employed job, but nevertheless they're jobs. Then why there is so much of crisis and push thing? So I feel this whole growth and jobs debate is muddled just because we don't have reliable, credible data to make take good stance on those. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry, thank you. I was just going to take one question from the chat box by Professor Srijit Mishra. So would you like to respond to that question, like your views on the employment front?
Can you read it out? Is it
Yes, yes,
good for
yes.
you?
Okay. I'm reading it out. So he has said that no nice presentation. Just a minute, sir. Give me one minute. Oh, there is some problem. Okay, sorry. Nice presentation. In particular, in marketing UPA with NDA. Is some
I think I did read his question now. So should I go ahead and answer?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so I think he's basically saying, I mean, I didn't speak about employment, partly because I don't really understand what is happening in the job market. But I think his question is, are you implicitly referring to the change in political mandate um, is the reason why the macro stability may not continue? So I think, I mean, the data does clearly show that we had higher inflation and uh, more depreciation and current account deficit during UPA than during NDS. And this is over 25 years, 3 NDA regimes and 2 UPA regimes. And if you compare it, so especially on exchange, if you compare it, what was happening to other currencies, as somebody referred to, you see that actually, the hawkishness towards inflation and exchange and current account is a lot more stronger under NDA than UPA. And so there is, I mean, we don't talk about it, but the data does say that. So even if you don't see it I mean, is it the choice of the chief minister, the finance ministers, the central bank governors, however it manifests itself, I don't know, but there is a clear sign. So I mean, so that was my belief that after the election, and people were asking about, what do you expect? I was saying, irrespective who comes back to power, I think India will continue to grow at 6.5%. But depending on who comes into power, you might have higher inflation or lower inflation. So I agree that some of the blip or the possibility that this is not a permanent change is influenced by my belief that when we have a UPA government, there will be more inflation and more exchange depreciation, and even if the growth remains the same. But as we discussed, whether a depreciation is a bad thing or a good thing, or even inflation, I mean, I know that inflation, when you go beyond 6-7% is a bad thing, but there's a high, there's a large range. I think, about 8 to 9 or 10% is bad, but there's still a very large range where inflation and growth could co-move together. So in that sense, I'm not passing a judgment that UPA regime would be somehow be bad for Indian economy than India. But I'm saying that's the reality of the data shows that you'll have less macro stability or less macro stability with a similar growth under UPA than what you see in India. And that's the reason for my concluding it as a blip and not a structural change. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Jugal sir, would you like to still ask question? You wanted to make some point on the trade policy?
No. I think he has answered very forthrightly. I have no further clarification. Basically, I wanted to raise the issue of the reversal of many of the good trade policy initiatives that have been taken and which have been reversed in the last 10 years or so. So that's the issue he has already expressed his view, and I thank him profusely for that.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. Amit, you can probably ask your question directly. You can unmute and ask your question.
Good evening, sir. Sir, am I audible? Hello?
Yes, you are audible. Yes.
So, yes, so good evening, sir. Sir, could you please bring the light on, could you please provide an insight on accounting for idiosyncrasies when analyzing India's current growth pattern, especially considering the neutral growth rate, which is said by this RBI, got neutral growth rate which is influenced by the economic period and structural changes, as governor of RBI has mentioned. And specifically, my question is specifically which factors should be prioritized and which should be discount out according to today's economic situation. Yes, thank you, sir.
Yeah, hi, Amit. I'm trying to get my head around the question. You're saying, I mean, obviously there's a big debate on what is the right neutral rate, and whether it's still 100 basis points as was earlier done, or should it be higher and all that stuff. Those discussions are happening, but I'm not quite sure if I understand which factor should be prioritized, in the sense when you saying factors, what do you have in mind? Can you just explain a little bit more what you are thinking when you're thinking of factors? I mean, these are monetary policy indicators,
Yeah.
like
Yes,
job
sir.
market.
Yes, sir. That is actually the monetary policy indicators and the three sectoral growths. That's what I'm actually
So
trying to understand.
this is a very interesting debate that's happening. So if you ask Ashima Goel, who is the MPC member, who is the most dovish, and she has always asked for an interest rate cut, if you look at the minutes of it. And she justifies by saying that there is still a lot of, there's still a lot of potential growth that can be tapped by lowering interest rate. You would actually, encourage more growth. But today, Arvind Subramaniam has an op-ed article in Business Standard today or 2 days ago, where he makes a claim that the reason Ashima Goel and other MPC members are asking for a cut in interest rate is not because potential growth is high, but because the actual growth is low. So his argument is that India's GDP statistics are not up to the mark, and what you're seeing today in India is that the growth rate is much lower, and that is he justifies that by saying private consumption is low. I think there are two other reasons he provides why. Jobs, there's not enough jobs, which means the growth can't be so high. If you have such high growth, then how can you have a job crisis? And there's a third reason. So in a sense, he looks at the same decisions, but he justifies by a very different thing. So when it comes to policy rate and what are the things to look at it, obviously different MPC members look at it very differently, and some put a lot more weight to job market situation and growth. Others focus a lot more on macro stability. I think RBI is increasingly more worried about next shock coming from the financial sectors, where the unsecured loans and some of the issues with subprime borrowers have been a big issue for them. So there's a lot more worry. The other worry that the RBI, I think, is worried is that they feel that the food price inflation that we are seeing is not transitory. They think this is related to climate change, and these are going to stay for much longer. So if you are looking at your MPC policies based on headline inflation, and if the headline inflation is such a large food component, the food price are going to remain elevated for a long time, then how do you do policy in that situation? And that's why what's the right neutral rate in the current situation is a big debate. I hope I answered some of the questions as I understood it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir.
Now, the last question would be by Subrat Das. Keeping in view the yesterday's incident of outage, Microsoft, how do you assess challenges of cybersecurity to global macro, financial, and economic stability?
That's a tough question to answer. Yeah, we produce in ICRIER a report called State of India's Digital Economy, SIDE report every year, where we compare or benchmark India's digital transformation or the progress in digital economy with the rest of the G20 countries. So I would recommend you to take a look. And we use a framework which is called CHIPS framework, CHIP. C is about how are we connecting Indians, all Indians, households and businesses and government agencies to internet, in accessible, affordable way. H is about how are you using internet to create growth, jobs, and service delivery. In I is to how do we, how are we doing with innovation in terms of the frontier of the technology. P is for protection, which is about how are you protecting our citizens. That's where the cybersecurity come in. S is about sustainability. So this is a CHIPS framework. So when you look at cybersecurity, obviously I don't have a clue how to think of it from a global point of view, and I think the Microsoft one does expose us, saying that there's a massive weakness in the global system and we are very interrelated. But if you look at India, we are very weak on cybersecurity. From a global perspective, we invest very little. Our firms invest very little when it comes to securing data and information. Indians also very unaware about it, so they don't demand it from their government and from business. Or they are very complacent that they feel information is okay. They are willing to share Aadhaar card numbers and everything very easily, and so they're not aware about. So in a sense, my point is this is a huge deal from perhaps from a global point of view, but much bigger deal from India point of view, because India has, we have the second largest network of internet users. We are doing very well when it comes to a lot of digital connectivity. So when you're bringing in so many people online and using, through digital public infrastructure, getting your finance inclusion, now your health ID and other things, it's a big imperative for India to think much seriously about cybersecurity issues now. So while macro stability is an important point in its own right, I think if you're thinking about structural issues and how India is going, and India is very digitalized by a global standard, India is the third most digitalized country in the world. Like if you compare GDP, similarly, if you compare the number of people on in the digital economy, India is very vast. So it is definitely one of the few priorities that the government should be thinking about at this point. Thank you.